Welcome to the Depth Dive. We're diving into plasticity today, and wow, you all sent in a ton of sources on this one. Clearly, it's something you're really interested in, and I can see why. As I started reading through everything, I realized there's this whole other side to plasticity. It's not just about positive adaptation, you know. There's this darker side, this reshaping through damage that really got me thinking.
It really is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
That tension between creation and destruction. That's really at the heart of what makes plasticity so interesting.
It all starts with the word itself. Honestly, do you know, plasticity goes all the way back to the 19th century, coined by Goethe himself.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it went that far back.
Yeah. And initially, it referred to both receiving form, like clay and giving form like sculpture.
That duality is really key, isn't it? And it gets even wilder when you think about how plasticity also relates to explosions.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Plastique in French means explosion. And plastic itself even relates to, explosives.
Whoa. Okay, mind blown. But let's bring it back down to earth, or rather to the brain. When neuroscientists talk about brain plasticity, they mean it literally.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just a metaphor. Our synapses, those connections between neurons, actually physically change based on what we experience.
So it's like our experiences are literally rewiring our brains.
Exactly. Which is why Joseph Malabou, this leading neuroscientist, said, you are your synapses. It's those tiny connections that make us who we are.
So our brains are like these sculptures constantly being molded by life.
Precisely. And this concept of plasticity, this ability to change and adapt, it's not limited to neuroscience either. Even Freud, way back when, recognized. But kind of plasticity in our desires.
Right.
What he called the libido.
He believed a healthy mind could both attach to things and let go when needed. Finding that balance between, clinging to things and being too flighty to form any lasting bonds.
It's like, imagine a sculptor working with stone. It rigidly holds its shape, right? Versus water, which is constantly shifting and changing. Freud saw the healthy mind as finding that sweet spot between those two extremes.
So fascinating. Both neuroscience with the physical brain and psychoanalysis with our desires, they both highlight these positive aspects of plasticity. But as I was going through all the sources you sent, a question kept nagging at me. What about the negative, the destructive side? Could there be a plasticity of rupture, a reshaping that happens through damage?
You've hit on something really crucial there, something that I think often gets overlooked. We tend to focus on plasticity as this wonderful ability to bounce back and heal. But what about those cases where the change is unwanted, even devastating?
Like with the new wounded, as some call them, people whose identities are completely changed by brain trauma or disease.
Exactly. Malabou, a philosopher, she uses that term to describe individuals who go through these really profound, often irreversible changes to their sense of self. And she argues that we need to look beyond the damage and understand the new identity that emerges, the new form that the brain is forced to sculpt.
So it's not just about the breaking, but what gets created from the broken pieces.
And that's where studying these individuals becomes so valuable. Antonio Damasio, very well known. Neurologists suggest that they offer unique insights into the mind's ability to adapt in the face of profound loss. Insights we just can't get from studying healthy brains.
Which brings us to the case that really exemplifies all of this. Phineas Gage. It's 1848, and this American railroad worker
suffers a horrific accident. An iron rod propelled by an explosion pierces his skull, damaging the part of his brain that controls emotions.
And the crazy thing is, he survives. But Phineas Gage is no longer the same man. He becomes impulsive, disrespectful, a complete stranger to those who knew him.
Gage's case became a landmark event in neuroscience. It really showed the world that brain injuries can profoundly alter who we are.
It goes beyond just loss. It's the creation of a new identity, forged through destruction, plasticity in its darkest, most unsettling form.
It really makes you think, if our brains, and therefore our identities, can be so drastically reshaped by these external forces, what does that say about the stability of who we believe ourselves to be?
It's like the accident revealed this hidden potential for radical change, something lurking within us all along.
Which brings us to a really interesting point that I think is often missed. Even Freud, who, championed the life drive, he acknowledged a darker force at play, the death drive.
Right, he called it thanatos, this instinct towards disintegration.
He saw it as a counterpoint to eros,
the
life drive that compels us to connect and create. But here's where things get really interesting. Freud only attributed plasticity to eros.
So he saw the death drive as purely destructive, not involving creating anything new.
Exactly. And that's where Malabou's argument comes in. She challenges that very limitation. If we accept that the death drive is fundamental to who we are, why couldn't it also be plastic? Why couldn't it be involved in forming new identities, even through these destructive means?
So we're talking about the possibility that trauma, this seemingly random external force, is tapping into something that's already working within us, something potentially driven by this death drive.
It's a pretty radical idea, isn't it? Perhaps the death drive, like the life drive, is also a sculptor. Its work most clearly visible in these extreme cases of rupture and transformation.
I'm starting to understand your fascination with these sources now. You're really grappling with this idea of change through destruction, wanting to understand it better. But with something as complex as the brain, can we ever truly grasp these transformations?
Even with all the advances in neuroimaging, there's still so much we don't understand. We can see the physical changes in the brain, but mapping those changes to changes in personality, identity, and subjective experience, that's a whole other challenge.
So we've gone from this word plasticity itself having this double meaning to the brain's literal ability to rewire itself. And now we're faced with this unsettling question. Could there be this hidden destructive force working within us all, shaping us in ways we can't even fully comprehend?
That's a powerful question, that idea of this hidden destructive force. And it makes you wonder if this plasticity of rupture could be happening in all of us, even without something as dramatic as what happened to Phineas Gage.
That's what I was thinking about, too. Most of us haven't had an iron rod through our skulls, thankfully. But we've all experienced some kind of trauma in our lives, right?
Absolutely.
Like loss, heartbreak, setbacks. Those experiences, they definitely leave their mark.
They do. Every time we learn something new, overcome a challenge, go through a difficult emotional experience, our brains are changing. Connections are being formed and broken pathways strengthened or weakened. It's like we're constantly being sculpted, but not always in ways that we choose or control.
Sometimes it feels like the sculptor's chisel is more like a hammer, especially when it comes to trauma. It can feel like this shattering blow, like a violent reshaping of ourselves and our world.
That feeling of being shattered, it's something Malabou talks about. She describes how trauma can lead to this kind of desubjectification, a feeling of alienation from ourselves. It's like we're no longer the same person we were before.
That makes sense. It's not just about losing specific memories or functions. It's about this fundamental shift in how we relate to ourselves and the world around us.
Exactly. We might feel detached, numb, or like we're observing our own lives from a distance. And this brings up a really important question. If we're constantly being reshaped by our experiences, both good and bad, how do we hold on to a sense of self? Is there a core me that remains unchanged?
Or are we just this collection of ever-shifting experiences and memories?
That is a question that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries, and there's no easy answer. But what we can say is that our sense of self isn't this fixed, static thing. It's dynamic, fluid, constantly evolving.
So we're all kind of works in progress, constantly being molded and remolded by life's forces.
In a way, yes. And that includes, as Freud pointed out, the forces of destruction and disintegration.
He really did see that death drive as a fundamental part of human nature.
He did. But remember, he didn't see it as creative. He believed it only broke things down, not built them up.
Which is where Malabou challenges Freud right. She argues that the death drive, like the life drive, has this plastic quality to it. It can also be a force of creation, even if that creation arises through destruction.
It's a pretty provocative idea, isn't it? It forces us to consider whether trauma, as terrible as it is, might also be a catalyst for change and transformation.
So instead of just viewing trauma as something to be avoided or overcome, maybe we can see it as a potential source of new understanding, new ways of being.
Now that's a profound insight. It really speaks to the heart of Malabou's work. She's not just highlighting the destructive potential of plasticity, but also the creative possibilities that exist within it.
She's saying that we're not just victims of circumstance. We're active participants in our own becoming. And it's that agency, that capacity to shape and reshape ourselves that gives us resilience.
Absolutely. It's not about denying the pain or difficulty of trauma, but about finding ways to integrate those experiences into our ongoing narrative and emerge perhaps stronger or at least different.
So it's not just about being molded. It's about being able to reshape ourselves in response to what life throws at us.
Precisely. And I think that's where the real power of Malabou's work lies. It's not just about understanding the destructive potential of trauma, but recognizing the creative potential that exists within that destruction. Which brings us to a crucial question. How do we understand these transformations, not just in terms of loss and damage, but also in terms of possibility and growth?
That is a great question. We've gone from the literal plasticity of the brain to the symbolic plasticity of the self, to this possibility of finding meaning and even growth in the face of destruction.
It feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
We are, and that's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. The implications of this plasticity of rupture for our understanding of identity, resilience, and even the nature of what it means to be human.
This deep dive into plasticity has been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has.
We've gone from the brain rewiring itself to the idea that trauma can reshape us in ways we never could have imagined. It's definitely heavy stuff, but I'm starting to see a glimmer of hope in all of this.
Yeah.
I see it too. Malabou doesn't just focus on the destructive potential of plasticity. She really emphasizes the creative possibilities within it as well.
It's like she's saying, look, we're not just passive recipients of whatever life throws at us. We're active participants in shaping who we become.
That's a great way to put it. And it's that agency, that ability to shape and reshape ourselves that gives us resilience when we face tough times.
So it's not about pretending the pain or the difficulty of trauma isn't there. It's about figuring out how to integrate those experiences into our story and come out the other side. Maybe stronger, maybe different, but still whole.
That's exactly it. And that's what I find so empowering about this whole concept of plasticity. Change is inevitable, but it doesn't always have to be something that just happens to us. We can be active participants in that change, even if the initial push comes from outside our control.
So instead of being like a lump of clay just molded by the world, we're more like sculptors, taking that clay and shaping it into something new, something meaningful, maybe even something beautiful.
I love that analogy. It really speaks to the creativity that I think exists within each of us. We have the capacity to take everything life throws at us, the good and the bad, and make something new out of it.
So let's zoom out a little bit from the philosophical. What does all this mean for us in our day-to-day lives? How can we use this understanding of plasticity to live more fulfilling and resilient lives?
Well, I think it starts with becoming more aware of our experiences and how they're shaping us. Are we interacting with the world in ways that support our growth and well-being? Or are we just passively letting ourselves be molded by forces that don't serve us?
It's like we need to become more aware of the sculptor's hand, both in ourselves and in the world around us, and start making conscious choices about what we want to create.
Exactly. And when those challenges and traumas inevitably come up, we can approach them with a sense of curiosity, even a willingness to embrace the change they might bring. Not because we like suffering, but because we recognize that even in destruction, there's potential for growth and transformation.
It's like saying, okay, this is happening, this is rough, but what can I learn from this? How can I use this experience to become more resilient, more compassionate, maybe even wiser?
Precisely, and that's where the real beauty of this plasticity of rupture lies. It reminds us that we're not defined by our past experiences, even the traumatic ones. We're always evolving, always becoming. And even in those darkest moments, there's always the possibility for something new to emerge.
It's such a powerful message. It's really given me a whole new perspective on the challenges I've faced in my own life. Instead of seeing them just as setbacks, I can start to see them as opportunities for growth and transformation.
Yeah, and that's the power of knowledge, isn't it? It can really change how we see the world and ourselves when we understand that we're not fixed entities, that we're capable of change and adaptation. A whole world of possibilities opens up.
The world feels less intimidating, more malleable, maybe even a bit more exciting. This deep dive has been incredible. We've taken this complex idea of plasticity and really explored it, its nuances, its light and shadow. I think we've come out the other side with a much richer and more nuanced understanding of what it means to be human.
We've certainly gone deep, and I think we've all learned a lot. But as always, there's so much more to discover. That's the real magic of this topic. It keeps inviting us to explore, to question, and to embrace the mystery of our own becoming.
What a great point. To our listeners, who knows what fascinating topics we'll dive into next, keep those sources coming. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep embracing that incredible plasticity of your own mind.